Well, let me first start by seconding what Kevin said about the distinguished audience today. It is truly overwhelming, for me even more so, because that's the first time I ever have to give a lecture in front of my mother. I never thought that would be part of the job description, but there you have it, things you do for the dissemination of knowledge. But I'll crack on and give you some background to our study. And first start with the point that a lot of what you hear today and a lot of what you can read in the book is really two people looking at the core executive from the outside. I want to emphasize here that neither Kevin nor myself have in any way a privileged access to papers relating to the core executive. You know perhaps that all government archives are covered by a blanket 30-year restriction. That has a problem of its own, but that's not the place to discuss it. We've never came across minutes of the cabinet, or indeed operational budgets or organograms were passed on to us. So we had to do it all ourselves, and that's not easy. But we were greatly helped by the considerable generosity that many very senior people in Greece has shown us. We were very lucky to have long and sometimes repeated interviews with all surviving Greek prime ministers of that period. We were able to interview all but one of the directors of the Prime Minister's office. And we're also very lucky to have spoken to a very large number of ministers, advisors, academics, and that is very important. That, in a way, is very much field work on the inside, but a lot of it depends on oral testimonies and oral histories. The true nightmare starts somewhere else, and that is an attempt to try and build a retrospective map of the heart of the Greek government that goes back to 1974. Just to give you an indication here, that between 1974 and 2009, there were 9 specific laws on the organization of the government, probably dozens of different fragments of legal provisions in various laws, hundreds of ministerial decisions and so on. It is a truly overwhelming landscape that only lawyers enjoy. And what we did in order to overcome this, we started from the Presidential Decree 63 of 2005, which tried to codify some of these provisions, and then using the NOMOS database, started to work backwards and generating a lot of paperwork that in a way you wouldn't even wish it to your worst nightmare. But that was very important for us because we were very anxious to produce something that was not simply an accumulation of gossip and of sort of memories of people, but rather try and peg it with the legal framework as that developed over the year. Part of that problem, of course, is, and that's something that Kevin has already mentioned, the lack of transparency. I estimate that perhaps between 1974 and 2009, perhaps the human geography of the heart of the Greek government would involve probably 500 individuals. That's not including ministers and vice ministers and so on. So the administrative or the advisory staff would probably be in the region of 500. Of those, many of those are accounted in the book, but the problem is that you cannot really account for all of them, because many of the appointments in the Prime Minister's office or in other bureaucratic parts of the government machinery are secondments. Now, secondments are not listed in the official gazette, so it's impossible to really find all the relevant documents that relate to people's appointment. That is a problem, of course, because the 500 that have served in this position, many with tremendous dedication and tremendous skill, we will never know. But at least we are confident that the more senior, at least, people who have served there, we have definitely accounted for. Just to tell you here that the official Gazette in Greece is non-name searchable before 1992. So even if you know the person and when was he appointed, it's almost impossible to find the relevant legal document that does that. This has changed a lot to the better since the introduction of the AVIA, and that's a really positive thing to mention. But the last point to make here is that neither Kevin's ego, considerable as that is, nor mine, is big enough to pretend to be delivering a lecture here, trying to pass judgment on people's achievements as our Prime Minister. Our role here is not to engage in some sort of a beauty contest. It is not for us to play God and say who's done a better job. In this sense, the operation of the government, the logistics of running the government, it's only a small subset of a wider range of reasons, of factors that can determine whether a prime ministerial tenure was successful or not. And this is where the fun starts. Because in trying to come up with a scheme that will help us understand how the Greek core executive, how the heart of the Greek government worked over the years, we focus our attention on 4 different themes. The first one is the Prime Minister as agency, the Prime Minister as a person, if you like, and his personal, it's only his, attributes. Then we look at the Ministerial Council, the Υπουργικό Συμβούλιο, and how that operated. Then we look at the operation of various government committees. Then we look at the work of the bureaucracy, if you like, of the heart of the government, the General Secretariat of the government, as it's called now, and of course the Prime Minister's office. And we hope that this kind of typology will help not only people in Greece to understand and reflect on how the system has worked, but may also travel in other countries, and that we feel is quite important. So I'll start first with the Prime Minister and look at the constitutional powers that is attributed to the post. Kevin has already mentioned that I don't want to talk too much about it, particularly since the constitutional reform of 1986, Kevin said it already, the Greek Prime Minister is very powerful, and he has remained very powerful all along. The second point to mention here is prime ministerial activism, and that's tricky because what we're talking about here is not how hard-working individual prime ministers have been. What we are referring to here is how different leaders interpret the job. The job of prime minister, like any other job, involves a degree of interpretation from the post holder. And here what we find is an interesting contrast. Konstantinos Mitsotakis, Konstantinos Karamanlis and Kostas Simitis were all leaders who engaged in policy detail. They engage with it in a very different way, but it is what you perhaps may want to cluster as a hands-on activist prime minister. That contrasts with the examples of Papandreou and Kostas Karamanlis. Papandreou, particularly for the 1980s, displays a lot of contradictions. In some areas, he would engage with policy detail substantially, particularly over foreign policy, parts of economic policy. In others, he would completely ignore it. Kostas Karamanlis himself, I think, interpreted the job also as one of a delegator, rather than as somebody who would engage with the detail. There are good reasons to do that. Other reasons that perhaps is not so good to do it, but it is interesting to see how different, of course, personalities and different leaders interpret their own job. In terms of the party strength, how powerful were in their own parties, I think it's true to say that with the exception of Konstantinos Mitsotakis and Kostas Simitis, all other prime ministers in Greece were pretty powerful within their own parties. Even Dimitris and Mitsotakis could command considerable support on a big part of the party, but having said that, also endure opposition to their authority from the party, and that's something to remember too. With regards to the Ministerial Council, to the Υπουργικό Συμβούλιο, we looked at a number of indicators here. The first one is that of stability, that is to say, how often prime ministers engage in government reshuffles. And we have defined reshuffle here as the appointment or dismissal of at least 3 ministers from the Ministerial Council. What you get here is, of course, the prime ministerial tenures of Andreas Papandreou and Kostas Mitsotakis that reveal a high degree of ministerial turnover. Papandreou in the 1980s would probably reshuffle, on average, his government once every 9 months. The record of Konstantinos Mitsotakis is also similar. The record of the third prime ministerial tenure of Andreas Papandreou is relatively better, but not so much so. Contrast that with the stability of the Ministerial Council under Konstantinos Karamanlis and Kostas Simitis, on average reshuffling the government once every 2 years, and also of Kostas Karamanlis, who ran the most stable, in that sense, government of all, reshuffling his team on average once every 3 years, so considerable stability there. Now, this indicator, what we call ministerial longevity, is quite technical, but I'll try and explain that to you. What we did is that we looked at the government protocol and we looked at the average ministerial tenure of the 5 most senior ministers, and there we contrasted that with the tenure of the Prime Minister himself. And we wanted to see whether long-serving ministers in the government could pose, if you like, a challenge because of their longevity to prime ministerial authority. What we find here is nothing tremendously interesting. More or less, the figures point to an average senior ministerial tenure that is roughly half of that of the Prime Minister. To a relative outliers here is that of Konstantinos Karamanlis in the 70s and the last tenure of Andreas Papandreou. What that tells you is that senior players within the government during these times enjoy a relatively long tenures. Although in both cases, particularly under the third Papandreou tenure, you see a lot of changes in the more junior ranks of the government. The next indicator is the frequency, that is how often the Ministerial Council met. And here the accumulation of the evidence was a nightmare in its own right. I won't go into details here. The main contrast is between the premiership of Kostas Mitsotakis and Kostas Simitis, where the Ministerial Council was met very regularly, typically once every 2 weeks, whereas under all other prime ministers, it remained very underutilized. Konstantinos Karamanlis would call a ministerial council on average once every 2 months. In the case of Papandreou and Kostas Karamanlis, the figure is lower. And of course, the influence of the ministerial council over policy reflects that. Although there are more variations here. I mean, obviously, under Kostas Mitsotakis and Kostas Simitis, the cabinet met often. In the case of Kostas Mitsotakis, with some grudges that sometimes the cabinet, even though it met very regularly, it didn't engage in a lot of proper discussion. The most stunning example here is, for example, the Skopjano, the issue of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, was never actually discussed in cabinet. And that is interesting. But I think it is true to say that under both tenures, the Ministerial Council did become an important platform for policy. I'm now moving on to ministerial committees, because I think this is where interesting things can be said. You might not really think so, but for anoraks like us, it does. And I start with the είναι cabinet, if you like, the Κυβερνητική Επιτροπή or the Κυβερνητικό Συμβούλιο, the senior group of ministers, and how often they met. Again, an interesting contrast here. Both Karamanlisses, but also Simitis and Mitsotakis did engage with the Κυβερνητική Επιτροπή, with the ministerial committee, with the government committee or the government council, as it was called before. It was a significant platform for the development of policy. Papandreou was more erratic. Sometimes senior minister will gravitate into his own universe, but it was never fully institutionalized, and it was never properly regular in that sense. To my mind, what is extremely interesting and relevant today, and relevant in explaining why policy failures happen so often in Greece, is the activation of less senior committees in government, because this is where a lot of the nitty-gritty needs to happen. And here, the story to be told is that these committees never work, for reasons that we can elaborate on later. Two possible examples here is Konstantinos Karamanlis, particularly with regards to the economic committee that Papaliguras used to run. It is definitely the case that certain relatively senior ministerial committees under the Simitis premiership worked regularly and with a significant influence, like the Economic and Social Committee, the Committee for Institutions, and of course the 2004 Olympic Games Preparations Committee. But the overall story here is one of a government machinery that only likes the big stuff. But when it comes to the detail, it can't get itself organized. And often it can't get itself organized because ministers don't engage with it. But that's something we can elaborate more in our discussion. I'll move on quickly to the bureaucracy of the heart of government, because this is also a very interesting, often completely overlooked part of how the government works. And we look here at three key areas. First of all, the size, how many people these services have. Secondly, how independent it is from political authority, from their political masters. And thirdly, how influential they have been over policy. And what emerges here is that in terms of numbers, those who work in the General Secretariat of the government, that is now called, has indeed increased. And since 2013, it has increased even further. But if you look at its influence over policy, the picture that emerges is a very different one. Normally, the government bureaucracy is irrelevant, definitely in the 80s and the 70s and so on. Under Mitsotakis, the appointment of Vagelos Voloudakis changes that, in that it's the first time that someone in that position gets notice in government. It certainly changes under Simitis, where Sokratis Kosmidis is the first Secretary General of the government who is a player on how the system works. Subsequently, the pattern has also been a bit sketchy. I think that under Samaras, the post was again influential. Under the first tenure of Alexis Tsipras, it has been. Now we don't know, but I think again the way in which the bureaucracy has operated within the government context has varied significantly. What is very important here, and true for the entirety of our leaders we looked at, is that this bureaucracy has never been independent. Greece is the only country in the world, possibly, which doesn't have a permanent bureaucracy at the heart of government. The appointment of the Secretary General is a political appointee. Everyone who works there is seconded. So no one stays around for more than 4 years. most people stay there for a lot less than that. So it is a very extreme case of fluidity and, of course, lack of independence. If you read books on Western European politics, for example, they are littered with examples of how the bureaucracy played politics against its leaders. Look at Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister to get a very good example of the importance that often these bureaucracies can have. I'll move on to the Prime Minister's office here, and that's, I think, also important. Three factors to look, and we were able to find the figures for it. The first is how many people are meant to be working there, how many posts are designated, looking at the legal documents. Secondly, how many positions of these were actually filled, and thirdly, the influence. And the story here, again, is interesting. We get from a Prime Minister's office with under Konstantinos Karamanlis provided for 22 posts to 2004 where we have 161. And even if you look at how many people were actually appointed to this post, the contrast is incredible. Under Konstantinos Karamanlis, you have really 5 advisors and 5 secretaries. That, of course, today is something that is very different. But if you look at the influence of the Prime Minister's office over policy, again, the picture is very diverse. It's difficult to make out a pattern. The Prime Minister's office in the first months of the Papandreou government in the 80s was very weak. Then it became a lot more powerful. But after 1987, it became very weak again. And in the third tenure of Papandreou, the Prime Minister's office, in terms of policy, was, if you like, very marginal. Possibly not so marginal on implementation, but in terms of elaboration, certainly very marginal. Look at the contrast between Kostas Simitis and Kostas Karamanlis. Both appointed a similar number of advisors at the various parts of the Prime Minister's office, but the influence of Simitis' office under Themelis was tremendous, both in terms of policy elaboration and implementation. Under Karamanlis, it was something different. It was more of a gatekeeping operation, not really something that engaged a lot in policy, on the instructions, of course, of the Prime Minister. And look at the Prime Minister's office of Kostas Mitsotakis, the biggest numerically Prime Minister's office, but again in terms of influence, not so important, particularly over policy. Dora Bakoyanni back then was very young. In terms of the gravitas that the office had vis-à-vis the senior ministers, it wasn't really that important. I will conclude by pointing to a couple of points and then pass on back to Kevin, trying to make up some sort of a pattern of everything we have discussed here. The first point to make is that there is no pattern, that the way in which the heart of the Greek government has been operationalized has varied tremendously. And that, in a way, is not big news, because different leaders have, as I said before, different interpretations of the job. They are different personalities, have different historical baggage. What remains constant, of course, and reading the papers will clarify that 100%, is that everybody thinks that there is a problem. The problem with that is that the problem is identified late. So when the Prime Minister actually gets into the job, it's too late to organize the Prime Minister's office. Problems take over in themselves, and the firefighting has to start immediately. In that sense, it is greatly paradoxical that the two, if you like, better organized offices, Prime Minister's offices of the Metapolitevsi, came under Prime Ministers who were accidental Prime Ministers in many ways, that they didn't have time to prepare. That is Konstantinos Karamanlis and Kostas Simitis. All the others would see the job coming, but somehow the problem of how we deal with this issue of coordination escape their attention. what we find in terms of the numerical strength of the bureaucracy, of course, there are more employees right now, but coordination still suffers. A big part of the problem, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that often those who are employed in the heart of the government do not have a very clear idea whether the role is an administrative one or an advisory one. The two very often get conflated. That creates problems of who does what, that creates tensions with ministers. The fact that there is no permanence, administrative permanence, at this part of the government makes things a lot worse. And I think that's something that I think we all need to remember. Perhaps the classic example of how the system produced very problematic results, I'm not talking about implementation here because Kevin is coming back to that in a minute, is the truly symbolic way in which the Greek government exercises its legislative initiative. I'm sure all of you have heard a lot about πράξεις νομοθετικού περιεχομένου and the fact that people criticize the government from taking untranslated dictates of the Troika and puts them to Parliament. They're right to criticize that. It's not a way of running the government. The government often runs out of time and cannot plan its activities accordingly. We criticize the lack of the loss of our national sovereignty because the government legislates on the demand of the Troika, but we are not worried that the government's legislative initiative is partly privatized, and that very often laws that go into the Greek Parliament are prepared by law offices and people who are not part of the government. They are private interest getting into the machinery of government. I'm not saying that there is anything suspicious or corrupt about this. It is an administrative failure, but it's a failure that we never pay attention to. We always pay attention to the big stuff, but not on the detail and on the delivery. And that often holds the key, in my opinion, to explaining policy failure. So Kevin will come back to say some wise words for a conclusion, but thanks very much for your attention.